you doing video? Are we?
Yeah. I find people engage more when you're on video. And I was watching a lot of other podcasters do that. And I was always like, I got a face made for radio. But then I'm like, but it's a medium that people enjoy and they see the interaction between people. So I enjoy it. I love the interaction. Plus, if you're talking too much, I can be like, Gary, I got something to say.
Yeah, and I do talk too much. So,
the first time I ever interviewed you was for Good Calories, Bad Calories, way back in the day, 2007. And I was so green to podcasting at the time. I tell people this story all the time. I guess the man I'm talking about should know the story too. But I remember asking you the very first question, and 45 minutes later, I was like, Mr. Taubes, can I please ask another question?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to say. Nothing is, well, some things are simple in this world.
Well, and back then you were very deep in trying to reach the medical community with what you were doing. And I often tell people, by the way, if you're going to look at the history of low-carb diets, you have to acknowledge Gary Taubes' contribution to that. So I tell them about the New York Times article, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? That was kind of your first big splash into this arena way back, what was that, 2001?
01 or 02, I forget. I think it might have been 02.
And then,
but there wasn't an arena to splash into back then. That's the whole point. there was Atkins and Eads and,
And it was pre-social media. It was pre-iPhone. There wasn't an easy way to get it out there, but it got out there. But people conveniently forget that. But you did get a book deal out of that it took you then 7 years to write Good Calories, Bad Calories.
5 years. It wasn't that.
It probably felt like 7 years.
Probably should have been 7.
Out there, 600 pages, which I remind people, 150 pages of that was just the citations, the science that proved it. When Eric and I wrote Keto Clarity, we had 186 citations on 20 pages. So it wasn't near Gary Taubes' level of scrutiny, I suppose, in the science. But guys, that's Gary Taubes. He's got a new book out I want you to know about. It's called The CASE for Keto. And I remember, like I said, when you wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories, I'm like, all right, Gary, we need a simpler version of this. Because I remember you and I talked about that. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, you came out, Why You Get Fat and What to Do About It. And then you got interested in the sugar, and you did a book called The Case for Sugar. And now you've turned that same kind of mantra into the keto. Why do you think?
Oh, wait, it was the case against sugar, just to be.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Sorry.
Don't want people to get too confused about what I do.
No. Yeah, you're right. The case against sugar. Yeah, because you, when you were on, it was like if I was presenting a courtroom case against sugar, this would be basically the litigation. And so the case for keto, you're basically defending keto with this new book. Why do you think keto has had its moment in the sun? Because you and I both have been at this a very long time. You much longer than me, but 17 years for me, over 20 years for you. Why now?
Well, because we still have an obesity and diabetes epidemics, and they're not getting any better, and the conventional wisdom doesn't help anyone. Or let me rephrase that. The people it helps are not part of the obesity and diabetes epidemic. So it clearly doesn't help most people, because most people in America are struggling with some version of overweight, obesity, and as long as they're struggling, there will always be fad diets as they get dismissed, offering the alternative possibilities. I mean, the point I make in this book is, we've all been there. We all did the conventional wisdom. We were getting fatter anyway. So then you look for an alternative. If you've you start thinking, maybe it's not me, maybe I'm approaching this the wrong way. And if you find something that works, you become passionate about it. There's no way to escape that kind of experience.
Well, and it has helped that we've had, and I remember you and I and other people in this community have had discussions, how do you kind of break through into the mainstream? And we all agreed somebody famous is going to have to go on the diet. And then LeBron James did it 5 years ago during a summer. And
let us not leave out Khloe Kardashian and the Kardashian sisters. And I'm saying that in all seriousness. No, it's sort of that's part of it. Like LeBron doing it. I think the other transition is part of the obesity and diabetes epidemics, and this is again part of what the context I'm trying to communicate in this book is physicians are not exempt from the problems. No. So as more and more physicians, and not only are there waiting rooms filling up with people struggling with obesity and type 2 diabetes, but they were struggling with it themselves. So they have to find a solution, and the internet made all of this, took it out of the, this is one of the things I had the opportunity to do, but then the internet takes all of this out of the hands of the gatekeepers and the people who edit the medical journals and whatever their biases, and allows people to go directly to the sources. So I have a question for you, though, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Because it's funny, it's sort of, to me, keto, like Atkins. And Atkins got pilloried in part because he was advocating a ketogenic diet. Nobody had ever actually embraced ketogenesis as part of this diet before. But I'm curious, I actually don't know when it shifted from Atkins to keto.
So let me tell you, I think paleo played a role in that. I think what happened was the Atkins diet had its heyday thanks to your work and others. Then he had the slip and fall, and it was tragic and everything. I came around in 2005, blogging 2006 with this podcast. It started to have a resurgence, but it wasn't rebranded as Atkins. I had an Atkins diet weight loss success, but it became low carb because of the vilification. It was like there was so much stigma attached to the Atkins diet. But then paleo came around and started talking about real food as a component of that. So I think what happened was Atkins went through the filter of paleo, turned into kind of a real food-based diet, and then it spit out keto on the other side of that. And when I wrote this book, I wrote it in 2013. It came out in 2014. Like, little did I know it was about to explode, keto as a movement.
Well, maybe that book did it. We should look at titles, keto in the title. It's interesting. What you're saying also suggests the possibility that paleo was a different form of low carb. So Atkins becomes low carb, carb restricted. There are a lot of ways to talk about it. I mean, the general message, and again, it's carbohydrates are fattening. That's the basis of all of this. And then paleo comes along, and now you have a low carb-ish diet that includes some carbohydrate-rich sources, right? As long as they're tubers and some fruits. And now you have to differentiate between sort of strict low carb, which is keto.
Yes.
And less strict low carb, healthy carb, which is paleo.
Right.
Or ancestral.
And a lot of the guys in the paleo community were CrossFitters. And so it was like fitness appropriate low carb. And so people would like, okay, well, if you're going to do that kind of glycolytically demanding workout, you need those extra clean carbs, and yet you still can be a fat burner post-workout because those carbs are serving a purpose during the workout. The other thing that I think shifted, Gary, is Atkins was so connected to Dr. Atkins. So it became this persona. Low carb, keto, even paleo, none of those have like a figure that they're attached to. And I think that's why keto took off.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's possible also. Well, thank you, Jimmy. We should write an essay on this.
Because when Gary Taubes writes essays, they don't stop. Actually, by the way, I recently read your Wall Street Journal article. Guys, go look it up. You wrote a nice article in the Wall Street Journal, obviously pimping your book a little bit, but kind of giving a little bit of the history of kind of why meats healthier than we think it is, and we should probably look at it, take a closer look at it. And you were bringing in the environmental aspect. It was very well done. I did it on Jimmy Rants. I did a whole episode bragging on what you were doing. But yeah, I mean, this topic of keto has not been, it's not new. Like you and I've been talking about it for a little while. Like you said, Dr. Atkins brought out the K word. They vilified him for it. But in the research world, that's been the most exciting. Like when I first came on the scene, there were a few studies by Eric Westman, a few studies by Jeff Bullock, a few studies by Steve Finney, and not much else. It was kind of a little bit barren. Now, you put a lot of studies where they were around the outer edges talking about it, but now it's explicitly being researched.
Yeah, no, now it's fascinating. Now you go to this website, clinicaltrials.gov, where people can register their clinical trials and, put in their primary sources and everything. And I mean, primary outcomes and search keto or ketogenic in the keywords, and you'll come up with, a couple hundred clinical trials, of which about 100 have already been completed. And they cover virtually any condition you could imagine, from Alzheimer's and autism to traumatic brain injury and cancer. Somebody is looking, testing whether a ketogenic diet will improve the prognosis or it's really, I mean, that alone is interesting. Although the flip side is obesity itself is still dominated by sort of conventional thinking on all this. I mean, we've made it, there's been a lot of movement, there's less talk about the fat content of the diet, and people are worried about ultra-processed foods, and it's a sloppy scientific terminology, and what it basically means is ultra-processed carbs, maybe vegetable oils.
Right.
But they still think in terms of the people eating too much, and it's just too damn tasty, and we can't say no to it, and lack of satiety factors, and pick your sort of naive scientific concept to explain a pretty profound physiological phenomenon.
Well, and Gary, I think we're still stuck on the calorie hypothesis hopelessly. Like, I think that's the last vestige that the apologists for the way of eating we've been promoting for years is they keep predicating it on calories. And it's really never been about calories. It's been about the hormonal effect, like you've been talking about for 2 decades. And why hasn't that message penetrated more? I mean, you've got more people at least talking and at least acknowledging insulin now, but they're not looking at it as the reason why we still have obesity and diabetes and Alzheimer's and all the rest.
Well, it's gotten to the point that it's sort of too big to fail.
Calories,
yeah, energy balance, it's everywhere. It's everyone, and there's huge amounts of research are predicated on this idea that our brains and our hypothalamus controls our intake and our expenditure, and that's what regulates fat accumulation. And I mean, it's too much research has been misinterpreted for this idea to be embraced. Scientific paradigm shift. So this is my obsession, has always been science and good science and bad science, and paradigm shift when fields are small. Okay, when there's a few very smart people who can dominate thinking in the field, and who can look at all the research and assimilate all the research and say, this contradicts that, and this is what we need to do, and this experiment has to be done, and this experiment, those are really interesting results, but I don't trust it. Can we redo that? And you have kind of a high signal to noise ratio. So of the experiments being done, enough of them are producing meaningful work that researchers can say this is right and that's wrong. We got to shift. Okay, but then as the field, once you shift, now the field goes into sort of standard scientific practice, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get more and more noise generated, which are all these tiny research projects that don't really shed any meaningful light on anything, but people can get funded to do them. And now it becomes virtually impossible to change. And all of this whole shift and everything that's done, all that noise that's generated is going to be predicated on whatever that original thought was when the field shifted. And if that thought was wrong, now you're stuck. Now there's no going back.
It's not helpful that we have people like Walter Willett, who has a big name because he's at Harvard.
Well, they're at Harvard. Well, you get to places like Harvard by believing what everyone else believes.
Yeah.
And replicating what they, interpreting your research to, it's just a problem with science. If you're arguing something opposite all the major figures in the field, it's very hard to get promoted. You don't end up at Harvard doing that.
But it's where you shift the paradigm.
It's where you shift the paradigm. Yeah. So
Evan Hall will never shift the paradigm.
And he doesn't want to. He wants to keep. He would say that, I don't want to do him a disservice this time, but he would say that, his research pretty much, he says his last study refuted multiple paradigms, multiple hypotheses. So I didn't quite understand his interpretation, but and that's the problem. So if I do a study and I can confirm the conventional thinking, I'm going to get published, and if it's on the interesting enough subject, I can get published in a very good journal. If I seem to refute the conventional thinking, the knee-jerk assumption, perhaps not incorrectly, is that I made a mistake or I misinterpreted it. And then, so we don't want to put this in a high-profile journal. We want to put it in a low. So all of science works to sort of recapitulating what you already believe.
Well, and isn't that the antithesis of science? Like, we used to herald when someone came up with an idea that bucked the trend of conventional wisdom. Now that seems to be poo-pooed, and let's keep everything the status quo. How do we ever break through and come up with new ideas, and especially with epidemics like obesity, diabetes, and all the cancer, all the rest? It seems to me there would be motivation to want to buck the trend. Something's clearly wrong.
Well, that's I find myself saying the same thing a lot, especially when people criticize you and they say, how can you go up against the conventional? So many people disagree with you. And it's like, look, dude, we've got this obesity and diabetes epidemics. They're out of control. The public health authorities have made zero progress. Okay, in 50 years, it's just gotten worse and worse. I mean, if this was lung cancer or AIDS or COVID or Ebola or pick your, deadly disease, it would be an unbelievable scandal. Their heads would be rolling. Administrators would be tossed out of NIH on their ears from third-floor windows. But because it's obesity and diabetes, like, hey, dude, we can blame the food industry and we can blame the people who eat the food.
Yes.
We don't have to take responsibility to question. And this effectively is what happens. So, and that energy balance thinking, that calories in, calories out, as I explained in the book, is at sort of the root of all the fat shaming that goes with it. Because if you think that, like you got to be 400 pounds just because you ate too much, dude, then don't eat so much. Right. And if you don't get back down to 200 pounds effortlessly, well, that's because you don't care, or you're too stupid to know that you should be eating less and exercising more. So either way, you end up getting shamed. I don't know. I'm a little frustrated in all this. I realize that this is, the problems with the energy balance idea have been at the heart of all my books. There's been at least one, if not multiple chapters on it in each one of my books. I'm working on a book on diabetes now. And then when I'm done with that, this is going to be, I think, my last book in nutrition, I hope. I have to write the history of that energy balance thinking and how it influenced and perverted not just obesity research and weight control research, but every field associated with obesity. So diabetes, heart disease, cancer, that thinking is everywhere. And you can, I documented in Good Calories, Bad Calories. You could show where it began. You could show what the counter argument was. You could show what the actual experiments that embraced it were and why they were wrong, and then how it spread from field to field. It's a fascinating story. And it's, we got to get rid of it, but it's not going to happen. I do think we've lost the battle.
Well, and Gary, you've been out there so long, and like I said, I came a few years after you did, but I sometimes feel that kind of weariness of, why don't people get it yet? Like, it seems so elementary. It's not a hard diet to explain, talking about keto. It's not really difficult to do. In fact, you kind of say, here's keto in a nutshell. Here's the simple thing, go. Like, it's not hard. What's the big roadblock? Is it because of the marketing of the conventional wisdom is still so alluring, and some of those old ways of thinking, you just can't get people to see Hitler as a good guy because they've Hitlerized saturated fat, and they've glorified and made Jesus out of whole grains. So it's like,
and don't forget fruit. Do not forget fruit.
Oh, I'm getting there. Yeah. Well, even like fruits and vegetables, like fruits and vegetables, they just throw it all together as if it's one word.
Yeah, no, and part of it is, okay, so what foods are we telling people not to eat? The foods that the food industry produces. Major food manufacturers, all the middle aisles of it's funny because everyone agrees that nutritionists would all say the same thing, right? The middle aisles of the supermarket, don't eat those. Okay, so that's 90% of profits in the massive food industry. That's a problem. It just I don't know. Again, I'm kind of mystified by this. Even with my latest book and the recent the pushback on Twitter about these ideas, we've got this very simple fundamental idea, right? Carbohydrates are fattening because of their effect on insulin secretion. Okay? Other foods probably aren't. So that's a very simple concept. And yet when you see this stuff debated, and you see even people going against my thinking and explaining why I'm wrong, they will never state the simple fundamental assumption at the heart of it, which is that carbohydrates are fattening. It's 200-year-old wisdom. The more refined they are, the worse they are. The more fructose in them, the sweeter they are, the worse they are. And if you're one of these people whose predisposition to be overweight and lose blood sugar control or triggered by the carbohydrates in the diet, then we can't eat them. Like, we can't eat them. You can't eat them. I can't eat them. Not if we don't want to be 200 pounds heavier than we are right now. Well, but nobody discusses it like that.
And we had that study come out 2 years ago where 88% of the population in America has some level of insulin resistance. So some are very, very insulin resistant, type 2 diabetes, all the rest. And then some are minimal, but they fall within that spectrum where carbohydrate restriction is the answer.
It should be, but even then, it just gets very complicated. So the plant-based community, whatever, they're mostly plants, all plant community will argue, right, that insulin resistance is caused by fat accumulation in the liver, which is caused by excess fat consumption, not carbs, not sugar, which is metabolized in the liver, but fat. And that's, to me, a misinterpretation of some basic science. But so not only that, then you have the public health, the funding agents at NIH, and they think they've moved behind all this. So they're not on Twitter saying, look at what the plant-based people are saying to the keto guys, the cults, the tribes that we're in. They're listening to the nutrition research community, which has been doing generating noise for 20 years now, ever higher levels of noise because it keeps getting bigger and bigger. And they're asking them what they should study. So again, they just announced yesterday a $150-something million project looking at, dedicated to sort of individualized dietary approaches to disease, the idea being that everyone's different. The good news is that they'll be looking at blood sugar. They'll be giving everyone CGMs, continuous glucose monitors. So they're looking at blood sugar. So that should lead them towards carbohydrate restriction. Bingo. Yeah, I've got one too. I haven't used it yet, but
Yeah.
So for them, it's all, everyone's different. There's no fundamental questions to be answered anymore. And the people making the decisions are, for the most part, federal bureaucrats, right? I don't, I mean, if you live in Washington, they're like GS-15s. I mean, they're very competent people, and they're good at running a government, as well as, depending on what your thoughts about the government are at any moment of time. But they're not the people you would want ultimately deciding on the scientific validity of obesity theories. And then, like we said, the people who rise to the top, who end up at Harvard and Yale and Columbia and run institutes, tend to be people who believe what everyone else believes. That's classic groupthink.
Well, and historically, and you outlined it beautifully in Good Calories, Bad Calories, when you have very powerful people get in powerful positions governmentally or research or whatever, like George McGovern did in the 70s, then you pump out dietary guidelines for Americans, first ones in 1980, and we just had the new ones come out, and they're almost identical to the original ones 50 years ago. It just doesn't seem to be moving at any kind of pace towards progress. And I know Nina Teicholz has been frustrated because they're not looking at any of the keto research because, all of those treat a disease of some sort. And so the dietary guidelines are for healthy people. And so this is how healthy people eat. So are we aiming for the
12%? Yeah, exactly.
What?
Yeah, we're aiming for the 12%. That's it would be a good title, Guidelines for the 12%. I think we're working on another book or essay here. Yeah, there's so many problems, but on a fundamental level, I don't know. I always use that phrase, a fundamental level. The advantage we have is people can go on the diet and it works. They can shift the way they eat. I don't like to call it a diet. So they shift the way they eat. They go from eating whatever they're eating right now, on which they are overweight, obese, diabetic, hypertensive, metabolically disturbed, insulin resistant, pick your terminology, and they stop eating carbs and replace those calories with healthy fats, and they get healthier. That's like an ace in our deck, 4 aces up our sleeve. So it's sort of, as long as that's true, this never goes away. And then the conventional wisdom is, well, it's impossible to sustain. And of course, I imagine telling someone, don't try to quit smoking because smoking cessation is impossible to sustain. So I don't know. It's a weird world, Jimmy.
Well, and we've lived in a weird world for a very long time. It's just people are a little more aware of the weirdness now, and they're shifting away from it. I thank God for the internet, like coming along when it did, and the iPhone kind of bursting. This show you're on now is like the longest running health podcast, and it's all about low carb diets. I have never shifted away from my main goal of promoting low carb, and I'm not the only one. There's a bunch of them out there now. I'm just the granddaddy when it comes to interviewing people. But like, it's amazing to me. The alternative media is where people are learning, and they're learning on their own, and they're willingly seeking us out because the mainstream has left them behind.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. The mainstream has failed them. The $158 million, what are we going to learn from that study that's actually going to help people? And the idea is, well, it's, the science. I don't know. It's interesting.
If they just reallocated that money to subsidies to buy steaks, I'd be happy.
Yeah, that would work. Yeah, there are clinical trials. You know me. There are trials I think we could do to settle this, but we have to get people to care. So, and when you say you've been doing this for so long and you haven't gotten off of low carb, and I've been doing it so long, and again, one of the criticisms of my book is I tend to reiterate the same themes over and over again, and that's because I'm thinking of ways to expand the impact, because we have to get to more people. So even the case for keto, I wrote it for, again, give it to your physicians, give it for physicians. I mean, if I was a physician And I was wondering how to make my patients healthy, and my patients keep showing up on this keto diet. I'm thinking maybe if they read the Case for Keto, they'll understand why other physicians like them find this so compelling.
Well, and look at Eric Westman. That's how he got into the Atkins diet.
Yeah.
He had to go on Atkins and said, I lost weight. I came off of my GERD medication. I did this, I did that. And he's like, what in the world is going on here? Because he was a curious physician. And a lot of the people that get into this, medical professionals that get into keto, they just stumbled on it because patients did well, or they themselves did well eating that way.
Well, and that's why when I get optimistic, I don't think we're going to change the scientific perception. I had hope for that a decade ago when I started NUSI, but that may be too difficult to do. But there's as a revolution that works from the bottom up, because every success story breeds other success stories, and every doctor who has a patient, so a patient as a brother or sister who did keto who got healthy, so they want to do it and they get healthy, and then their doctor sees that they got healthy, and the doctor themselves says, has an Eric Westman experience, right? What's going on here? Maybe I should try this, and then they get healthy and they talk to other patients. So it spreads. It's slow because it's not disseminated from the top down. There's no government decree involved, but it's the reason it never goes away is because it works. The reason keto is the most searched diet term on Google is because people want to know how to do this, how to get healthy. And I think it's sustainable because people want to sustain their good health.
You know what has changed over the past 15 years? 15 years ago, when people got sick, they went to a medical doctor because they assumed that the medical doctor had nutrition knowledge. They don't, they never have, and all the other things to get them better. Now we have the rise of not just naturopaths, but functional medicine practitioners, nutrition-minded, other kind of medical professionals. You've got a lot of undoctoring going on. I know Bill Davis wrote a book called Undoctored, and it's where patients should take control of their own health. There's labs online. You can go and order your own labs. Now, you still need help interpreting, but you can run your own labs. You got gizmos and gadgets. I wear a ring to track my sleep and my heart rate variability, and I keep track of it on my own, that maybe we don't need medical doctors unless I break my arm.
It's possible. I mean, it's interesting. If you think about it, the medical doctors, well, one of the places we went wrong is we shifted from treatment of disease and injury, like a broken arm, to doctors who are trying to basically doing preventive medicine. And preventive medicine is you've got a hypothesis that if you give them this drug, a statin, or you put them on this diet, a low-fat, mostly plant diet, that they will live longer. And you actually have no evidence whether or not your intervention works, because you can put somebody on a low-fat diet and, if they die a week later or 30 years later, you have no idea whether the diet helped or hindered it. There's no information there. So physicians started to see their jobs as preventive medicine. That's what they were told to do, and particularly with the statins and the heart disease medications. And for that, you don't even know if they're helping. They don't know if they're helping. You don't know if they're helping. They're all based on statistical analyses of large data sets so you're probabilistically helping someone live longer. Like, I'm increasing the likelihood by 70% that you'll live longer, but I'm also increasing the likelihood by 30% that you'll die prematurely.
Right.
Or some of you will die. You have no idea. And then the flip side is, look, you got a problem. I'm 50, 100 pounds overweight, or I'm moving into diabetes, and I don't want to take drugs and inject insulin for the rest of my life, or I'm hypertensive, and they've been telling me to not eat salt, and I've been eating incredibly bland meals for the past 3 years, and I'm now on my blood pressure medications. A couple years ago, I was sitting at my local Berkeley coffee shop when I bumped into one of the world's most famous nutrition writers, and I asked him what he was doing in this part of the world, and he said, well, I was seeing my doctor to get on, my blood pressure's elevated.
Who was it?
No, that will never be said. doctor-patient or doctor-patient kibitzer privilege here. But anyway, so you've got one of these problems, and then you've got a relative who's saying, hey, I was the same way, and I gave up carbs and replaced it with healthy fats, and now I'm not. So yeah, I mean, it's always a good idea to have a doctor involved. So if something goes wrong, you've got a fail safe. For many people, especially if you're diabetic, you can't do this without medical supervision, because you're going to have to come off your insulin very fast.
Yeah, it changes really fast. I remember Eric Westman telling me that he had someone come off of 200 units of insulin in one day. Like,
yeah.
How would you predict that if you didn't have medical supervision? So you're right.
Well, that's what many of the doctors I interviewed, some of them will, tell their type 2 diabetic patients to stop using insulin before they start the diet, because high blood sugar isn't going to kill them in the short term. And, you have a couple of days of elevated blood sugar, and then better than, one critical hypoglycemic episode that sends you to the hospital.
Yeah.
But yes, that's I mean, especially in the age of COVID, I'm of mixed feelings about the benefits of physicians. I think in the medical community, clearly there are things for which they're very important, and other things I think they just lost touch with what medicine really is, which is making patients healthy.
Well,
not managing chronic disease.
If anything, this pandemic has shown us is the miserable failure of them being preventative care physicians. Like, obviously, we have issues that are underlying that then manifested because of this virus. And so it seems to me that should be the indictment that says, hey, you failed, something else needs to happen. And there's a point I want to bring up with you. I think when we classify all of these diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, we're doing a disservice by fragmenting the one disease. And it's the disease of insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, the things that you and I have been at many conferences together, hearing all the wah, given the science. And they're all the same disease. So if you consolidated it and said, okay, how is your insulin resistance manifesting as disease? Oh, it's type 2 diabetes. Okay, here's the specialist to deal with the insulin resistance in that way. Oh, it's heart disease. Oh, here's the specialist. So that's what I envision for the future is you're going to have a doctor's office that treats the insulin resistance and then the specific way that it expresses itself in your body.
I mean, that would be ideal, right? Because I do agree with you. They're all manifestations of insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, high insulin levels. And yeah, you treat that, with change your diet, and then let's see I mean, some of the complications are not going to be reversed by changing your diet. Cancer, which if we're right, cancer risk is driven in large part by insulin and hyperinsulinemia, and you can lower your risk, but you're not going to be able to make the cancer go away. So now you need a doctor to help you with that if it's still possible. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you can probably, I would guess some huge proportion of patients would do perfectly fine with no drugs on a very low-carb ketogenic diet. I'm not a doctor repeating that. The type 1, you're going to still need doctors. So there's things. And there's always going to be, I don't know, it's just we created the diseases. We created the perfect storm of bad advice for treating the diseases by telling everyone to cut back on dietary fat, and it's okay to eat carbohydrates, and sugar is benign, and Atkins is a quack, and you couldn't have given worse advice for the diseases that our food industry has created. And now, we have to fight to get people healthy. So,
well, and we've seen some progress. The American Diabetes Association, as you well noted in your Wall Street Journal article, the president of that organization now has said, wow, low carb did very well for me. Let's put it in the recommendations for people with diabetes. So that was a great kind of influx,
Well,
which, by the way, it also happened in Canada. Diabetes Canada also promotes a low carb approach for treating diabetes best as well. But then we're stuck miserably with the American Heart Association, still stuck on vilifying saturated fat, pushing vegetable oils, just down the line of really bad advice. And yet, what's the number one killer in America? It ain't that virus out there. It's still heart disease.
Yeah, well, and this is the we screwed up, but nobody ever admits they screwed up. They'll just you slowly shift the advice, and the advice is shifting from low-fat diets to higher-fat Mediterranean diets. They'll still never get as far as they should. Yeah, I hope the diets don't kill us in the next 20 years so we could see where we stand. My feeling is there'll be an ever-increasing percentage of people eating this way because they can stay healthy, and an ever-increasing level of confusion because every month that goes by, another book comes out, most of them arguing variations on the same thing. It's funny, I can write a book saying, look, Atkins was right, Eads was right, South Beach was right, Jimmy Moore was right, they're all right, they all say don't eat carbs, look how healthy I get when I don't eat carbs and replace them with fat. Sugar busters, those guys are right, paleo guys were right if you're a CrossFitter. And, but if you're coming out, if you're a physician and you're writing your own book, you have to add something new to it, right? You can't just say what everyone else has said. So, and again, that's one of the, my book, The Case for Keto, was originally titled How to Think About How to Eat. And the idea was if you're, one of us who is fattens easily or can't control their blood sugar or blood pressure, then this is how to think about it. And then one of the things people always like, the conventional wisdom is, well, all these people are quacks because they're all saying different things. And the truth is, or the alternative way to see that is that they all agree on 90% of what they're saying, which is don't eat carbs, replace it with healthy fats. And then the other 10% is what Malcolm Gladwell called the patent claim that makes their book different.
Right.
When
I wrote Keto Clarity, it wasn't like the concepts in Keto Clarity had not been articulated before. It just had a new spin. I made it more consumer friendly because like all the books before that was just wah, 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 and it just nobody understood it. So I infused my personality into it, and that's why it was successful. And you've been a great writer because you're just an incredible writer with all the books that you do, and that's how you connect. You can write real sciencey, geeky, but you've done better in recent years of writing more.
Well, I can always refer them back to Good Calories, Bad Calories. Once that. But I tend toward science geeky because that's what interests me. Even my diabetes book, it's like, I'm having trouble writing this chapter because it's what interests me. But who in the diabetes world is really going to want to read a chapter on competing dietary programs pre-insulin and how they influence what we thought after insulin? But
historical reference is wonderful, Gary. Like, don't discount that. I think that's how you convince.
Well, and that's how I convince, and that's how it's interesting. It's fun too, I have to say. Not the writing. The understanding is fun. Turning understanding into writing. I think the reason I may be a better writer than many people in our field is just because I'm trained as a writer to relentlessly keep rewriting.
Your writing is wonderful, but your historical perspective, it has been like the hallmark of all your writing. I remember Good Calories, Bad Calories, as tough as it was for a layperson to read. I enjoyed the history. Oh my gosh, that's how we got into this. Nina came along and was a little softer in her interpreting of the history. It was a little easier to understand her. But like everybody has their ability, and yours is definitely bringing in the historical context that then makes today seem a lot more, okay, well, now I know why we do that.
Well, that's it. And the point I make in the case for keto is if you don't understand the history of your beliefs, so how can you actually claim to know what you're talking about if you don't know the history of what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Because at some point along the line, you've decided that you believe something unequivocally based on the state of knowledge at the time. But if you don't know what generated that state of knowledge, then you have no way of knowing whether or not you should really believe in it. And we live in a world where, medicine, nobody teaches history of the field. When you're in med school, you've got too much to learn. I think that's the problem. Doctors, they have so much they have to process in order so they can diagnose and treat patients, that the idea that they should learn the history of what they're processing so that they could make some judgments about its validity. I mean, I don't even know it's funny, doctors will say 50% of I had a professor who told me that 50% of what I know in medical school and whatever I'm being taught in medical school is wrong, but we don't know which 50%. If you knew which 50%, right, you wouldn't teach it. So they know that, but they're not taught to critically assess. You don't want the doctors trying to decide themselves which 50% is right or wrong. You want the scientists, in air quotes, to do that. And the problem is, the scientists aren't treating patients. So now one of the problems, you've now disassociated the research on the disease from the actual disease itself. There are people, we've been having the Twitter debate between Kevin Hall, Gary Taubes, Stephen Guillenet, or Stefan, I still can't remember how to pronounce his first name. And let's see, who else? Chris Gardner, he's got a PhD in nutrition. Guillenet's got a PhD in neuroscience. Taubes has 2 master's degrees. Kevin Hall's a physicist. None of them have ever treated a patient. None of them have ever, including me. I mean, I'm come closest, right? Because I have people at least read my books and then email me or meet me at conferences and say, look, I lost 100 pounds because I took your advice. Where are the doctors in this debate? Where are the people who have success? What is wrong with finding out who successfully treats obese patients and who doesn't? And what the difference is between those two approaches. And that's what medicine used to be before this evidence-based medicine movement. It used to be, if you were treating a disease, there were a lot of ways, by the way, you could screw up your interpretation by having a physician make these judgments. But if you're treating a disease like diabetes, the chronic progressive disease, a type 1 form without insulin kills quickly and horribly. And you've got 2 approaches, and one keeps the patient alive and the other doesn't. You don't need a lot of fancy statistical analysis, right? You just need the physician knowing if I do diet A, I can keep my patient alive, and if I do diet B, I can't. Therefore, diet A is the better. So anyway, it's a crazy world we live in.
So Gary, I think, and thank you, by the way, for writing the case for keto. I think it's especially since keto as kind of a book trend is on kind of the downward spiral. So this might be something that revives it again, because your books have that effect on the industry. But like, I feel like keto's had its day in the sun. It's been wonderful. We all been waiting on it for years to be able to see a little bit of mainstream acceptance of low carb. And so if keto was the thing that did it, and now carnivore's having a bit of a moment out there as well. Although were out there long ago as well.
Who was out there long ago?
The zero carbers.
Oh, zero carbers. Right. Yeah, it's just that basically some of it is the problem where, news is what's new, right? So if you want to get media attention, it's got to be new. Again, as we said, if you want to publish a book, it helps to have a new argument, because it's hard to get a book published that's just making the same arguments as every other book that's come along. Carnivore is fascinating, right? Because the people who are eating exclusively carnivore diets are supposed to be dead, according to some of our bedrock beliefs in nutrition science. And it certainly makes some people healthier. I would try it if I had the family structure that would allow for it.
How old are your kids now?
They're 12 and 15, but it's, my wife is a mostly vegetarian. She's not going to tolerate her husband eat and, cooking and eating meat in the house all the time, only exclusively. It's one level of, radical dietary therapy that she's not willing to go to. But the reason it has a moment, it's like a perception thing, it's what people are talking about at the moment. There was one of my favorite quotes. I quote this in the Case for Keto. Is from a famous journalist, screenwriter, director named Ben Hecht in the 1930s. Wrote some of the great screwball romantic comedies of that era, and he said, trying to tell what's happening in the world by reading the daily papers is like trying to tell what time it is by looking at the second hand of a watch. And so what you see is what the second hand is pointing on all the time, which is, carnivore, and what terminology is keto, or, gut biomes, or ultra processed foods.
Right.
That's the second hand. The minute hand. The hour hand has been on low carb and carb restriction, and carbohydrates are fattening for 200 years. That's so all the noise around it is all the new terminology, all the new approaches, all the variations on a theme. And the signal has always been carbohydrates are fattening, and it probably, goes through insulin and insulin resistance. And that's so we have to keep bringing people, I feel my job is to keep bringing people back to the signal, even if it means saying the same thing every 5 years.
That's why my brand is Living La Vida Low Carb. All the trends that come and gone, Living La Vida Low Carb fits that so perfectly. And it's like, I will always talk about low carb diets because I agree with you. Like it's the core. It's that main hour kind of, it's right on low carb. People understand that that's the thing, whatever you call it. And I remember every time things come out, when paleo came out, a reincarnation of the Atkins diet. Keto came, reincarnation of the Atkins diet. I'm like, not exactly, but nuanced, yes.
Pretty damn close. And this is what's funny is it's, one of the ways people dismiss it is they'll say, well, it's just Atkins. And it actually is just Atkins. And Atkins was just Taller, and Taller was just Pennington, and Pennington was just Donaldson, and Donaldson was just Banting, and Banting was just Briat-Savarin, because it's the same fundamental idea. That phrase Briat-Savarin used in 1825 was more or less rigid abstinence to, well, he called them farinaceous foods, and today we would call them carbs.
Right.
That's the message. And when I talk to these physicians for the book, they weren't concerned. They didn't measure ketones, despite the book being called The Case for Keto. They didn't think particularly, they didn't really care if their patients were in ketosis or not. They wanted to get their patients off sugar, starches, and grains. Maybe legumes too. That's it. It's like, don't eat these foods. If I can get you to not eat these foods, I can make you healthy, because these are the foods that are making you sick. Unfortunately, like we said, those are the foods that the food industry produces. So people tend, and it's much easier. We were talking about ways that this gets confused. The functional medicine people have been great, but the functional medicine people think food is medicine, right? So if I can get you to eat the right things, it's going to make you healthier. Like berries are great, and kale is great, and the way I think about it, for whatever it's worth, is food can be poison. Some foods are toxic. Most foods are benign. They're neither, they're okay. They're great. They give you calories. They keep you going. You're healthy. You're fine. Some foods are toxic. Don't eat the toxic ones. It's an indifferent message, right? And they're not toxic for everyone. We all have friends, neighbors, cousins who can eat those toxic foods all day long, just like we know people who smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and live to be 100.
Well, and that's the complexity of this whole topic of obesity and chronic disease is there is no like one size fits all. You can make the case for keto, and I would argue that most people, if we're going to default to a diet, keto would be the default diet, not the crazy low fat, high carb diet. That works, we know, on a certain segment, but the vast majority of people, if they don't need keto, keto won't harm them. But if people need keto, but they do low fat, high carb, it will harm them. So context is everything. And I think that's where we're heading next after keto kind of has its moment. I think we're over kind of diet prescriptiveness. At least this is my hope, Gary. I've been at this a long time like you. I hope with all hope that we can finally kind of customize, like I would love those dietary guidelines to give you 5 or 6 options. Here's the vegetarian vegan option if that's what you want to do. Yeah. Here's support for it. Here's the keto option. Here's the support for it. Here's kind of a real food paleo version. Here's the support for that. Mediterranean. And then the cockamamie one they have now. But then let people choose equally, make them all wonderful equally, rather than this is the way, all the other ways suck. U.S. News and World Report will make keto last place. Like I'm overall.
They always do. But again, even in that, I love that idea. But all those 5, whatever, healthy food eating patterns, none of them would include the highly refined carbohydrates and sugars, right? So there's even when you talk about everyone's different. And we're different in some ways. I'm not sure how different we are in most ways, in the important ways, but you're still saying, look, some of these foods are toxic.
Right.
You know, those foods, there's no way I can tell you this is a healthy way to eat if it includes 2 Coca-Colas and, Wonder Bread for lunch. Unfortunately, Coca-Cola and Wonder Bread are going to take offense to that statement. So, Houston, we got a problem. Yeah. Anyway, we are making progress.
Well, we are making progress. From the first time I interviewed you 14 years ago, I think we're in a far better place now. People are at least acknowledging carbohydrate restriction has validity. Like, did you ever believe that was going to happen back then? It was so quiet after Dr. Atkins died. It was dead there for a few years.
Yeah, I mean, it was dead in an interesting way. I probably said this the first interview. I remember I was living in New York at the time, and I went dinner with a friend in the theater district, and we were in this fancy old restaurant, and my friend was saying, yeah, Atkins' death kind of, and Atkins, the Atkins company had declared bankruptcy. Right. And he said, that whole movement's kind of dead, isn't it? And I said, I don't know, is it? And the waitress came over, and I turned to the waitress. I said, excuse me, how often nowadays do people ask you not to put the bread on the table and hold the bread because they don't want it? They don't want to eat it. And she said, oh, that happens all the time. And I turned to my friend. I said, it's not dead. The name Atkins, Atkins's company is regrettably, but this idea that carbohydrates are fattening just keeps moving on. The other thing is, when I wrote Why We Get Fat, and at the chapter at the end, it's called And What to Do About It. And the last chapter is the end, What to Do About It. And I wanted to get advice from physicians who prescribe low-fat diets, low-carb diets for their patients. And I remember, so I talked to Eric Westman, and I talked probably to Mike Eads, and, maybe Steve Finney and Jeff Volek, although they're not physicians. Well, Jeff isn't. And what was her name? Mary in Kansas.
Mary, sorry, there's several Marys. Mary Gannon, Mary Newport. Oh, no. Anyway, Mary, yes, I remember.
Yeah, she's very smart, used to work with Atkins Foundation, and had legal issues with paying her taxes. And but that was it. There were like 6 of them I could think of to call.
Vernon.
Mary Vernon, right. And that was it. That was 2010 when I was writing that.
Right.
And now there's a Facebook group in Canada of Well, there's like this Facebook group in Canada of women physicians who eat low-carb, high-fat diets and prescribe them to their patients. And there's 4,000 members in this Facebook group, which is women physicians. And as far as I can tell, according to my friend Google, there's only 40,000 women physicians in Canada.
Yeah.
So that's 1 in 10 of every woman physician in Canada is basically eating like we are.
Wow.
Which is the exact opposite of what U.S. News and World Report suggests. And we could assume that their physicians, maybe only 40% of them are overweight. So this might be 1 in 4 of the women who have weight problems, women physicians who have weight problems, just in Canada alone. So it's, and in doing this book, I could have talked to, as you put, I could have talked to thousands of physicians. I capped it at 120 because I had to start writing. The world has fundamentally changed, and it's done it against enormous pushback because you've got the plant-based movement with the environmental arguments for right or wrong. I got pilloried just for taking the environmental argument seriously in my Wall Street Journal article. The ethical arguments against me, the idea that none of us should eat meat now because eventually there's going to be 10 billion people on this planet, and 10 billion, it can't sustain 10 billion people eating meat-rich diets. And yet it keeps going because it fixes what's wrong with us.
Gary, you should be very proud because you've had a huge role in that, all the books you've written. And definitely, guys, go get The Case for Keto. It's Gary Taubes' brand new book. Wherever you get books, definitely Amazon. You got the hardback, the Kindle. You never read your own audiobooks, dude. I'm disappointed in you. I remember getting Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, and it was this very professional speaker, and I'm going, I want to hear Gary's voice.
I hear my voice on a recording. It sounds like I never left Rochester, New York 51 years ago. And I do read to my kids every night still. They're 12, but not every night, about 3 nights a week. We've been going through Sherlock Holmes, and I'm proud of my reading ability, but I don't know if I'm that proud. So,
dude, I have done 6 audiobooks with my books, and it's a grueling process, but like people are like, oh, I love hearing from the author because I can hear the inflections, and you've got little inflections in your voice. It would be fun to hear while you're reading your book. Anyway,
down the next one, I will keep it in mind. Jimmy, thank you very much.
For the next one, then you can thank Jimmy Morris.
Oh.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for being here today. It's always fun to talk to one of the seminal people in this low-carb movement, and I've loved knowing you for many years. Keep up the good work.
Jimmy, thank you, and you keep up the good work too. It was fun.